Are we right now living through the end of, well, 500 years of Western ascendancy? It's a massive question, isn't it?
It really is.
And maybe, like the author of the source material we're diving into today, you felt the weight of that question, maybe not in a history book, but, in a specific moment.
Right.
Perhaps watching that breathtaking spectacle of the Olympic opening ceremony in Beijing. Or maybe sitting in Carnegie Hall, just completely captivated by the music of a young Chinese composer like Angel Lam.
That feeling, yeah, that kind of visceral sense that something fundamental is shifting on the global stage. That's exactly what frames the central theme of Niall Ferguson's book, Civilization, the West, and the Rest.
And that's the source we're unpacking today. This book, well, it takes on the huge task of trying to understand how a relatively small group of people living on the western edge of Eurasia, what we generally call the West, managed to dominate the world for the last, half a millennium.
And crucially, what might be happening to that dominance right now.
Exactly. So our mission in this deep dive is really to guide you straight to the core of Ferguson's analysis.
Yeah, we're going to pull out the most important historical arguments, the key factors he identifies, his compelling comparisons between different civilizations.
And the evidence he points to for, well, a potential rebalancing of global power today.
Think of this as your fast track to understanding this pretty complex perspective.
Right. We're here to quickly and thoroughly grasp the book's core ideas, not necessarily to agree or disagree, but just to understand them. So you can get a handle on this big picture historical argument without feeling, well, overwhelmed, ready to jump in.
Let's do it. So Ferguson sets the scene around 1500.
Okay.
At that point, if you look at the global stage, European powers were really not major players. They occupied only about, 5% of the world's land surface?
Wow, only 5%.
And at most, maybe 16% of its population.
Right, so they were kind of small potatoes globally.
Definitely. But then, fast forward, just about 400 years to 1913.
And the transformation is, well, it's absolutely staggering.
Isn't it? By then, 11 Western empires controlled almost 3/5 of all the territory and the population on Earth.
3/5. That's huge.
And get this stat. Close to 3/4, a remarkable 74% of global economic output was coming from the West.
74%. That is just a monumental, unprecedented shift in power in, historically speaking, a pretty short time.
And Ferguson argues this wasn't just some random fluke or, purely down to brute force, although force was certainly involved.
Right.
He identifies what he calls the 6 killer applications. These were the sort of fundamental institutional and cultural innovations, the unique advantages that gave the West its decisive edge for centuries.
The killer apps. I like that framing. Okay, what are they?
So the list is competition, science, property, medicine, consumption, and work.
Competition, science, property, medicine, consumption, work. Got it.
And to really appreciate the power of these apps, we need to compare that starting point around 1500 Europe as, a relative backwater with other major civilizations of the time, particularly Ming China.
Absolutely. Ming China was, arguably the most sophisticated civilization in the world back then.
No question.
They had incredible feats of engineering like the Forbidden City, just this symbol of immense centralized power. And they launched these epic voyages like Admiral Zhang. Reaching places Europe couldn't even imagine then.
Right. Adam Smith, even centuries later, still referred to China as one of the richest countries.
Yeah. Contrast that with, say, the Thames River in early 15th century London.
Which Ferguson notes was barely a trickle compared to the mighty Yangtze River in China.
Right. And European exploration seemed driven by this intense, almost cutthroat competition. A race for spices, Lisbon versus Venice.
Whereas the Chinese voyages, while amazing, were more about showcasing the emperor's power, collecting tribute, not really focused on trade in that same European competitive sense.
And the political structures were so different, which seems key.
Massively different.
In China, you had the Forbidden City as the single, undisputed center of power. In London, power was much more fragmented, wasn't it? Shared uneasily between the crown, the lords, the commons, even institutions like the City of London itself.
And this fragmentation, particularly in Europe, that's the breeding ground for the first killer app.
Yeah.
Competition. Europe's geography, all broken up by mountains like the Alps and Pyrenees, made it harder for one single power or even an external force like the Mongols to dominate the whole continent compared to somewhere like China.
Makes sense. But the flip side was that Europeans were just constantly at war with each other.
All the time.
Hmm.
Between 1500 and 1799, Spain was apparently at war 81% of the time.
81%.
England 53%, France 52%.
Wow.
But Ferguson argues this wasn't just chaos, it was actually a powerful engine for innovation. Fortifications had to keep getting better to withstand new cannons, navies had to evolve constantly.
Ah, so this fierce internal military competition actually pushed technological and organizational progress forward in a way that maybe a big, unified, less threatened state wouldn't experience.
Exactly. That competitive drive then feeds right into the second killer app, science.
Okay.
And a crucial invention here was Gutenberg's movable metal-type printing press. Developed in Mainz, it was just much more flexible and scalable than other printing methods.
Which allowed for an explosion of written material.
Totally. And this technology directly fueled the Reformation. Martin Luther immediately saw the power of printing in the vernacular, in German, not just Latin.
Right, so he could bypass the old gatekeepers.
And flood the market with his ideas challenging the Catholic Church. It was a revolution not just in printing, but in how dissenting ideas could spread, like wildfire.
And the scientific revolution that followed, that really took off in the next centuries, was overwhelmingly European, wasn't it?
Yeah, Ferguson points out that roughly 80% of the key figures came from this surprisingly specific region. He calls it the Glasgow-Naples hexagon.
Interesting.
And in stark contrast, Ottoman scientific progress during this same period pretty much stagnated. Ferguson links this to what he describes as the unlimited sovereignty of religion at the time, which could sometimes constrain independent scientific inquiry.
There's a really fascinating comparison he makes between the Ottoman Empire under Osman III, who he kind of portrays as overseeing a state in decline,
Yeah.
and Prussia under Frederick the Great, who was pushing through reforms that turned his kingdom into this model of efficiency.
Yes, Frederick the Great. Despite his father apparently disapproving of his intellectual hobbies, he cultivated relationships with top thinkers like Voltaire and Maupertuis, and he founded the Prussian Academy.
But the structure of that academy is important, right? Ferguson notes it was meant to be very top-down.
Absolutely. It reflected Frederick's belief that any system, scientific or political, should really flow from a single powerful mind.
And Voltaire found that stifling.
He did, yeah. Having experienced more open intellectual circles, he found it restrictive compared to the more decentralized, almost competitive network model you saw in places like the Royal Society in England.
So even within the science app, how knowledge was pursued really mattered.
Definitely. And this era also saw practical scientific advances with direct military uses, like Benjamin Robin's work revolutionizing ballistics.
Ah, so science feeding back into competition.
Exactly. While Ottoman artillery had been formidable back in the 16th century, European advances, as observed by people like Montecuccoli, just surpassed them by the 17th century.
Which leads us to that Ottoman official, Ibrahim Mutefarika, who way back in 1732 basically asked the core question of this whole source, didn't he?
He did. Why do Christian nations, which were so weak in the past compared with Muslim nations, begin to dominate so many lands in modern times? Something fundamental had clearly changed.
Okay, so that's competition in science. What's the third killer app?
Property, and specifically how its distribution was linked to political rights. And here, the contrast between British North America and Spanish South America is really stark.
How so?
Well, in British North America, land was distributed relatively broadly. Even if it started with things like indentures or crown grants, ordinary settlers, people like Millicent Howe and Abraham Smith in the source, could actually get grants of land.
Ordinary people, right?
And crucially, influenced by thinkers like John Locke, owning property was tied to political power. Often, owning 50 or more acres gave a man the right to vote, and property rights, once you had them, were generally pretty secure.
Okay, so wider distribution linked to political voice. What about the Spanish system?
Very different. Conquistadors, like Geronimo de Aliaga mentioned in the text, received these vast encomienda grants. These were basically huge feudal estates that concentrated land and wealth in the hands of a tiny elite.
So reinforcing inequality from the start.
Exactly. And that system just perpetuated deep inequality and kept political power concentrated.
And religion played a different role, too.
Yeah, Spanish colonies generally had a religious monopoly under Catholicism. Now, this produced remarkable figures like Fray Pedro de Córdoba, who bravely spoke out against abuses, but it was still a single, powerful institution.
Whereas in North America,
Particularly in the British colonies, you saw Protestant diversity really flourish. This fostered a kind of culture of dissent, multiple viewpoints, independent organization, which became a really fundamental and lasting part of American society.
interesting. So competition, science, property.
Yeah.
As the West expanded,
Hmm.
these apps traveled with them.
They did, sometimes bringing progress, sometimes, well, devastation.
Okay, let's talk about medicine, the fourth app. The impact on human life here seems huge, right? Life expectancy in the West more than doubled between 1800 and 2001.
Yeah, from about 28 and a half years to nearly 67 years, it's an incredible leap.
But in the colonial context, medicine had a much more complex role, maybe darker.
Definitely darker. West Africa was famously known as the white man's graveyard because of tropical diseases. The monument on Gorée Island to the 21 French doctors who died from yellow fever in just one outbreak in 1878. It's a pretty grim testament.
Wow.
European mortality rates in the colonies were just staggeringly high. Colonial officials, on average, died 17 years younger than their counterparts back home.
So that pressure must have spurred medical research.
It did. It led to the development of tropical medicine institutes like the Pasteur Institute and schools in London and Liverpool dedicated to it.
And did Western colonial medicine actually bring benefits to local populations?
Yes, it did bring some measurable progress in certain areas, things like smallpox vaccination campaigns in Senegal or efforts to control malaria. And this sometimes allowed figures like Blaise Diagne, who's mentioned, to rise through the French colonial service.
But the reach was limited.
Always limited. Far too few doctors, too few health posts for the huge populations involved. And then there's the really disturbing shadow side that Ferguson highlights. The emergence and, frankly, the perversion of medicine into pseudoscience.
Right.
Specifically, racial biology and eugenics, asserting this hierarchy of races based on totally flawed science.
And this pseudoscience found a horrific testing ground.
In German Southwest Africa, modern-day Namibia, the genocide of the Herero people on Shark Island, described by missionaries like August Kuhlmann, carried out under figures like General von Trotha, prisoner mortality rates reached nearly 80%. It's horrific.
It's awful.
And Ferguson draws a direct line from this precursor to future atrocities of the Third Reich,
Such as?
such as the treatment of Red Army prisoners of war, where millions died from deliberate neglect. And even the idea of black shame, this racist fear about Senegalese soldiers stationed in Germany after World War I supposedly polluting the Aryan race. It shows how these warped scientific ideas had truly terrible consequences.
Okay. A very sobering aspect of that app. Let's move to the fifth one. Consumption.
Right. Ferguson looks at the Industrial Revolution not just as a sudden event, but more like an industrial evolution.
Using Darwinian terms.
Yeah, mutation, speciation, survival of the fittest, but applied to economic organization. The focus was just relentless efficiency in cotton textiles, steam engines. Bolton and Watt famously said they weren't just selling machines, they were selling power.
But all that production needed demand, right? You need people to buy this stuff.
Exactly. That's where the growth of a consumer society became absolutely crucial.
Which wasn't universally
Not
celebrated.
at all. Critics like Carlyle, Marx, Engels pointed out the negative social costs, the dehumanizing cash nexus, the dramatic rise in social inequality, starkly shown by things like the Hamburg cholera epidemic, which hit the poor hardest.
Still, it physically changed the world, transformed cities. Think of Haussmann basically rebuilding Paris.
Absolutely. And personal dress simplified dramatically, away from elaborate historical clothing towards military uniforms, standardized male suits. Inventions like the Singer sewing machine, just mechanized clothing production, made it way more accessible.
And the U.S. started to pull ahead.
Yeah, by 1900, the U.S. was already overtaking Britain in manufacturing output and productivity, and Western consumer culture started spreading globally.
Things like jeans, Coca-Cola.
Right. Sometimes adopted eagerly, like in Japan, where Tokyo tailors explicitly copied English designs, sometimes resisted, famously by Gandhi.
And consumer goods even became a kind of weapon in the Cold War.
A subtle one, yeah. That famous Khrushchev-Nixon kitchen debate was literally staged in a model American home, full of consumer gadgets.
Showing off the consumer lifestyle.
Exactly. And blue jeans became this powerful, almost rebellious symbol of Western life behind the Iron Curtain.
Fascinating. Okay, that brings us to the sixth and final app.
Work.
Right. Ferguson revisits Max Weber's idea of the Protestant work ethic.
The argument being that for Protestants, work wasn't just a job, it was seen as a kind of divinely willed purpose, leading to a culture of living to work.
Pretty much. And literacy, boosted by the Protestant emphasis on reading the Bible yourself, was also a key part of this package.
But today, he notes, there's a real contrast. Yeah, Europeans generally work significantly fewer hours than Americans and way less than many Asians.
Neither change.
He points toward secularization, especially accelerating after the 1960s in places like Britain, as playing a big role. He kind of speculates whether the original work ethic has been undermined by other factors too.
Like,
Well, maybe the welfare state, or perhaps a rise in self-obsession, even the influence of thinkers like Floodade focusing on the inner self rather than outward duty.
interesting ideas. He also touches on modern American evangelicalism.
He does, suggesting it might have shifted towards a form of consumer Christianity, which he argues maybe dilutes or changes that original, stricter ethic, even where you'd most expect to find it.
Okay, so those are the 6 killer apps that Ferguson argues drove Western dominance for 500 years. Where does he see things heading today? Is the magic fading?
Well, he points directly to the financial crisis of 2007-2009. He notes it was fundamentally made in the Western world, a crisis born of overconsumption and way too much financial leverage, debt, basically. And he contrasts that sharply with the much higher savings rates seen across Asia.
Right, a different economic model.
And this highlights a clear economic shift that seems to be underway. China's rapid growth trajectory suggests it's on course to overtake the US and Europe economically. Well, maybe within the next 10 to 20 years.
That's him.
That's the projection. And you have other giants like Brazil and India rising too. Meanwhile, Western hard power seems less able to dictate events globally. You see that in recent conflicts.
And the economic philosophy.
That Washington consensus, this set of free market policies the West promoted for decades that seems to be dissolving. Plus, the U.S. is carrying a massive amount of debt.
It's not just about money, right? He looks at other metrics.
Yeah, things like shifting military power, China spending way more, rising academic output from Asia, and educational attainment is a big one.
Like those math scores.
Exactly. When you compare the math scores of 14-year-olds in places like Singapore or Chinese Taipei with the UK or Italy, the gap is pretty stark. China is also making huge strides in publishing scientific papers, in supercomputing power.
So the foundations are shifting. What about that chimerica idea?
Right. Ferguson coined that term to describe the sort of symbiotic economic marriage between the U.S., the big spender, and China, the big saver and creditor.
And that marriage is on the rocks.
It looks increasingly unstable, yeah. And critically, he suggests the breakdown seems to be benefiting the creditor, China.
And there's maybe a less tangible shift too. A loss of confidence.
He touches on that, yeah. Maybe symbolized by the decline of traditional Western civ courses in universities. A sense of questioning the narrative, perhaps.
And culturally.
He points to things like the comeback of religious clothing in parts of the Muslim world. For instance, in Turkey under Erdogan, reversing some of Ataturk's strict secularist policies. He sees this as one symptom of a global Islamic revival.
And contrast that with the West.
Yeah, contrasts it with ongoing trends of secularization and maybe relativism in the West. It brings to mind that old Chesterton quote or idea often attributed to him.
That when people stop believing in God, they don't believe in nothing, they believe in anything.
Exactly. That's the kind of cultural dynamic he's hinting at.
So all this evidence, these shifts,
Yeah.
it leads to a really fundamental question. How does a civilization actually decline?
Yeah, if this shift is happening, what does it look like? History gives us some patterns, like the fall of the Western Roman Empire,
Margin of evolve?
external pressures, migrating groups often called barbarians, the presence of a powerful rival empire like Persia, and lots of internal instability, internal terrors.
Some theorists have tried to model this.
Right. You have Arnold Toynbee, who talked about challenge and response. Civilizations decline when their leaders stop responding creatively to new challenges.
Like a failure of leadership.
Essentially. Then there's Pitram Sorokin, who suggested civilizations cycle through cultural phases: ideational, focused on the spiritual, sensate, focused on the material, and idealistic as a mix.
But Ferguson leans towards a different model.
He does. He prefers thinking about civilizations as highly complex systems. Maybe less like rigid pyramids, more like adaptable termite mounds, operating near what scientists call the edge of chaos.
The edge of chaos. What does that mean?
Well, the key thing about complex systems is that they can look really stable for long stretches of time, but underneath they have this potential for sudden, really large breakdowns.
Okay.
Think about forest fires or earthquakes. Most days are fine, small events happen, but the system allows for these massive, devastating events to occur seemingly out of the blue. They follow what researchers call a power law distribution. Big ones are rare, but possible, and hard to predict from just looking at the small ones.
Ah, so it's not necessarily a smooth, gradual decline.
Exactly. He suggests this model might be a better way to understand things like financial crises, which can just erupt after long periods where everything looked fine, or maybe even civilizational shifts.
And history has examples of these seemingly sudden collapses.
It does. Even if the underlying causes built up over time, the actual collapse can look quite abrupt. Think of the French Revolution, a rapid implosion of royal legitimacy.
Or the Ottoman Empire.
Right, despite attempts at reform, it was basically gone by 1922. Or the Japanese Empire, huge expansion after Pearl Harbor in 42, total collapse by 45.
And the Soviet Union is a prime example, right?
Absolutely. Seemed outwardly stable, monolithic even, right before its remarkably sudden dissolution in 1991. It caught a lot of people, including the CIA, by surprise.
So these examples show that decline isn't always slow and linear. Complex systems can fail quite rapidly.
That's the takeaway. They highlight the potential for rapid systemic failure.
Okay, so we've taken a real deep dive into Ferguson's argument here. We've traced how he argues the West's dominance was built on these key killer apps
Looked at his comparisons with other civilizations, like Ming China.
and examined the signs he points to today, economic, educational, cultural power, suggesting a fundamental shift might be happening in the global balance of power.
And we've explored some historical examples and these complex systems ideas that suggest how such shifts or declines can happen sometimes with surprising speed.
Which leaves us, and you listening, with a pretty provocative thought to chew on, doesn't it?
It does, given those historical examples of sudden collapses in complex systems and the clear evidence Ferguson lays out about power shifting today.
The big question maybe isn't just if there's a rebalancing or even a decline happening for the West, but how it might unfold.
Exactly. Does the future hold a dramatic bang, a sudden crisis or collapse, or is it more likely to be a long, lingering whimper as influence gradually fades?
That is definitely something to ponder. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material.